Hello, grade school. Happy damn Friday. What's going on with you guys? Happy almost Christmas. Or just past Hanukkah. Or whatever other holiday you celebrate. I don't care. We're here to celebrate the year-round holiday of color grading. What the heck's going on, guys? I hope you're doing awesome. I'm doing pretty good. I'll be honest with you. I am coming rather abruptly up out of a bit of a coding vortex. So it may take me a minute to figure out what sight and sound and words and interacting with anything other than math and code is. But I'll come around. I'll get there, and we're going to have a great session today. I'm excited to be here. I'm always excited to see you guys for Grade School Friday. We're doing another freestyle grade school, so get your questions ready. Think about whatever you want to talk about, whatever you want to discuss. That's fair play today. If any of you guys are here who have been making comments on videos, who I've been trying to get back to over the last week or so, and you want to follow up on anything that we talked about in those comments, this is a great venue to do so. I'm yours for the next hour, and I think we're all going to learn a little bit of something, as we tend to do here on Grade School Fridays. So welcome. Glad you're here. Let's party. Gadali, you're here with me, aren't you?
I am here.
Okay, you are
Oh,
you are present. What's going on with you, dude? How are you?
it's the holiday season, which is a festive time to celebrate having time to watch a bunch of movies.
Absolutely. Well, and since you mentioned the word festive, I forgot to wish everyone the most happy to observe the most significant holiday of the season, which is, of course, the Festivus. Any Seinfeld fans out
Festivus
there?
for the rest of us.
Festivus for the rest of us. That show just gets better over time. That's the funniest.
Oh yeah.
That's the funniest show ever. Um, okay, well, we are coming in cold. Like I said, I feel weird. There's lights on. I'm talking to Gadali already, and soon enough, I imagine we'll be talking about everyone's color grading questions. But let's do it. The sooner we get into it, the sooner I'll get out of my coding vortex tunnel vision mode. We just turned up. Any questions so far, Gadali?
Yeah. Let's see. Andrew is asking, can you comment on any difference between monitoring in RGB versus YUV?
I think we talked about this recently. Honestly, no. That's one of those situations where, as long as what you're sending agrees with the display on the other side, it shouldn't really matter. I like to monitor in RGB just because that's fundamentally less complex. That means I'm not having to encode to YUV to a display that is set up to decode YUV to then reproduce red, green, and blue emissions from its screen. But the truth of the matter is, if that's what your display wants is YUV, we have the ability to send YUV from Resolve. So those two situations, sending YUV to a YUV monitor versus sending RGB to an RGB monitor, you should get the same net image. That's the whole premise of the alternative standard. So if you can do RGB, do it, because that's one less step. But fundamentally, there should be no difference.
All right. What's the difference between tetrahedral interpolation and the color warper?
Interesting. Interesting question. So, tetrahedral interpolation is a slippery thing to talk about because at the simplest level, I think I understand why this question is coming up, and I've heard it before. But at the simplest level, if you say to me tetrahedral interpolation in the strictest, most mathematical definition, all that means is this. I have a really good visual. It's a good DCTL that I prepped for this. Let me see if I have this really fast here, guys. This might be a worthy rabbit hole. If not, then we can just sort of we can verbally explain it. Ooh, I have it. I'm so happy. Do you know how rare it is for me to be able to quickly find a DCTL? It's pretty rare. Okay. I'm just going to try and relaunch my Resolve, and I think I might be able to give you guys a visual demonstration of tetrahedral interpolation. Oh, and that's super weird. When I close Resolve, I'm looking at myself on my reference monitors. I don't want to see that. That ranks at the very bottom of the list of images that I want to look at. Quickly relaunch Resolve, please. For goodness sake. so that I don't have to look at that. Okay, let's go back into some grade school vibes here. Okay, moment of truth. Let me see if my little tetra demo thing is ready to look at. Okay. Wow. Okay, I'm gonna show you guys what I'm seeing. So how do I do that? What are things? Okay, here's what we need to do. I've been bemoaning to Gadali, who's a very indulgent listener, about the woeful state of some of my most needed IT and such here on my home system. So that's what I'm dealing with right now, guys. It's a whole second screen thing. I promise this is going to be worth the wait. Well, I hope it's going to be worth the wait. Okay, so I'm going to show you some resolve along with this zany image right here. Ever seen anything like that before? So here's what we're going to do. I'm actually going to move away from the warm and fuzzy color page of resolve, and we're going to go over to Fusion. Anybody want to party in Fusion? Did anybody think that we were going to go into Fusion today? I didn't. But when we're talking about tetrahedral interpolation, I think the visual that we are about to see is super, super helpful. So we're going to go to a single view here, and we're basically going to just look at a 3D RGB cube, okay? So that's all I'm doing right now is just setting up a 3D RGB cube that we can monitor so we can look at processes being applied to that RGB cube, all right? Now I'm going to go to this tetra demo that I was just looking at. This is designed to visually help explain exactly what we're going to talk about here. So when you have tetrahedral interpolation, what that typically means is we're talking about the way that, you know, if you think about a LUT is going to take an input and then it's going to look at a table of values that it has and produce an output. Makes sense, right? So simple sort of example there before we get into what I wanted to show you here. Think about a multiplication table, like when we were in elementary school. Did you guys do multiplication tables when you were in elementary school? I did. Multiplication table being like, all right, you've got a row, you've got a horizontal, and you've got a vertical that goes from, like, say 0 to 9 on the horizontal and 0 to 9 on the vertical. And if you look at that table, you have a lookup for what any product of any of those two things might be. So if I wanted to find 5 times 4, I would click across to the 5 and then count down to the 4, and I would look down there in the square, and if the multiplication table was correct, then I would find 20, right? That's what 5 times 4 is. So it's just a lookup table. A multiplication table, you didn't know it at the time, but that was your first exposure to a LUT. That is literally a lookup table in that you are looking up the results of an input. You say, well, for an input of, in this case, 5, 4, my output or my result will be 20. You follow me so far? So think about this now. What if I wanted to compute 5.5 times 4? Now, I don't know about you. I don't know about the multiplication tables that you had when you were in elementary school, but my multiplication tables did not have decimal points. What's the next column over from that 5? That's 6, right? So I can tell you what 5 times 4 is, and I can tell you what 6 times 4 is, but I can't tell you what 5.5 times 4 is. There's no entry for that in this table. Follow me there? So that problem arises all the time when we are applying LUTs to actual pixels, which, remember, are just numbers, all right? In fact, most of the time when you are applying a LUT to an image, most of the pixels that you are passing through that LUT are going to fall in between the sample points of the LUT. Sample points being, in the case of our multiplication table, 5 and 4. The next sample up is going to be 6. I don't have a 5.5 entry for that horizontal row, right? So interpolation is a fancy word for what we do in between those things. Does that make sense? So again, just to go with our multiplication table example, 5 times 4 is 20. 6 times 4 is 24. If I were to add 20 and 24 and divide those by 2, I would get what? 22. right? That's what's called linear interpolation. That's one form of interpolating, of estimating, of guessing. Well, if 5 times 4 is 20 and 6 times 4 is 24, if I'm a LUT and I don't know how to actually do like mathematics and I can just estimate values, how am I going to estimate the value in between? Well, one sensible way would be to do a linear interpolation like I just described. Tetrahedral interpolation is a little bit different. What tetrahedral interpolation is going to do is it's going to look at the problem in 3 dimensions, and it's going to say, okay, for my input pixel, which might fall anywhere in this cube, that's what this RGB cube represents. I could have a triplet, a potential input triplet, anywhere in this cube, right? If I'm all the way down here at the bottom, that's pure black. If I'm all the way up here at the upper right, that's pure white. And then I've got my primaries. I've got cyan, I've got blue, I've got red, I've got yellow, I've got magenta over here, and I've got green hanging out somewhere as well. Make sense? So I could have a value that comes in anywhere in here. All that tetrahedral interpolation is doing, this is the whole, everything that we've just talked about is just a preamble to what I want to explain to you now. All that tetrahedral interpolation is doing is looking at which tetrahedron, which I've sliced my cube up into, does the input pixel fall into. That's all that tetrahedral interpolation is doing, okay? So if we look at this cube segment slider that I have here, I can show you the 8 tetrahedra that this cube gets sliced into in a tetrahedral interpolation algorithm. Can you see that? You see those hits that I'm getting? There's a total of 8. And all that I'm doing when I perform tetrahedral interpolation is looking at which of these tetrahedra, which of these subshapes within my cube, the input pixel resides within, and that's the foundation of how I'm going to compute my output. Does that make sense? That's what tetrahedral interpolation is. Now, there's different ways that you can use it. Tetrahedral interpolation is really going to be in the domain of a LUT. That's what we're going to use tetrahedral interpolation on. However, there are other ways that we can use tetrahedral interpolation, and some of you guys might be familiar with this. This is probably more along the lines of what you are asking your question about, where we can actually perform manipulations of our image based on those tetrahedra. So I can do something like this. I can pull down my, for example, let's get right side up here. I can pull down my red in red, and I'm influencing. Can you see what happens when I pull that red way down or way up? I'm contorting one of my tetrahedra, right? One of the tetrahedra within this image or within this cube. So this is not necessarily tetrahedral interpolation. This is manipulating the vertices of the tetrahedra within my cube and ensuring that there's no breakage. That's essentially what this algorithm is doing, okay? So that's different than tetrahedral interpolation. This is a tetrahedral manipulation scheme. I'm manipulating my cube and the resultant image values based on the tetrahedra in my image. And if we just want to actually get a sense for what that actually looks like, let's do this. I'm going to move this histogram over to the left here, and we're going to look at an actual image over here. And I'm going to apply this tetrahedron in 2 places, and you can see the effect that that's having on the image, okay? So if you've hung with me for all this, great job. We're going kind of deep for a like second off the bat grade school question, but like I said, my head's already in the coding zone anyway, so why not? Let's have some fun. The last thing that I will point out, the original question is, what's the difference between doing, I assume you are asking, what is the difference between doing something like this versus using the color warper? Well, there's 2 main differences that I would call out. The first is that tetrahedral interpolation is very linear, okay? So I really can't produce much bend in my shape. Things tend to be moving in straight lines. Can you see what I mean there? The color warper can work in curves. I can bend and shape and contort things in a bit of a different way. So I would say with the color warper, you potentially have more degrees of freedom, or at least you have more ability to contour your cube than you're going to get with tetrahedral interpolation. And then the other thing I would call out is that the tetrahedral interpolation here is fundamentally broader in nature, like it's making broader adjustments. And that's actually a positive thing, because when we think about the color warper, think about how easy it is. Most of us who've spent any time playing with the color warper have produced breakage, right? Some kind of artifact or nastiness in our image. It's easy to do because you can get very, very, very narrow with your adjustments in the color warper. With the tetrahedral here, you would have to hit this really, really hard and move into like extreme negative values to get like true breakage. Now you might get stuff that's like, well, that doesn't look amazing, but we're not necessarily artifacting until we go really, really far with this, okay? So those are the two things that I would call out. Tetrahedral manipulation of a color cube in this fashion is linear in nature, and it's generally broader in nature. And the color warper has the potential to be nonlinear, as well as the potential to make much more fine-toothed adjustments than we can make with tetrahedral interpolation. And here I thought that we would go a whole year in grade school without ever going into the Fusion page. No such luck. We made it over into the Fusion page. That's a lot to bite off. If you guys have to watch the replay, I would go do that. We just talked about a lot of color science in a very short period of time, but I hope that's helpful for the original question.
Well, I learned a lot. All right. So Computech is dealing with slog 2, and it's 8-bit and underexposed, and they're seeing a lot of banding when they use color management. How would you deal with that?
Interesting. Well, that's a good question. I wish I had some slog2 material to work with here, but my answer, by the way, look at that cube segment here from our last exercise. That's pretty fun. Anyway, what I would think about there for dealing with delicate slog material, you know, there's this tension. I'm always here on the channel trying to show you guys the ideal, the optimal way of getting results, the most repeatable, the cleanest, the purest form of the ideas, because I feel like I owe that to you. However, I can tell you as a colorist, I make all kinds of compromises all the time based on what actually is going to work for the job to get it out the door and looking good within the limitations of time and the material I'm working with, etc. So in your case, I would say, you know, like if you've got slog2, 8-bit, underexposed, you know, the 8-bit underexposed thing alone, that's you recognize that's of course not ideal. So maybe in the future, if it's your material you're shooting, you've learned something about how to nail a better exposure for your image, for example. However, for your use case today, I would look at simplifying things. Okay, so you could do one of two things. You could sort of like temporarily throw away my script for color management completely. Okay, so let's just do this. I don't have any Sony material here handy. Actually, that's not true. I can find some Sony stuff. So I'm going to disable this. I'm going to disable my look. So I've got no color management going on whatsoever. And let me just show you how I would tackle like color managing something more delicate. Let's see. I don't have any Sony stuff here, but that's okay. Let's just say this shot is some Sony material. I would simplify my color management just to see if this still produces the issue. I would just do a color space transform. I don't know if it's S-gamut maybe, but you said slog2. Then we're going to go Rec 709, gamma 24, and then, you know, these are my settings that I like for tone mapping. You're welcome to steal them if you find them useful, but they're conservative and useful. Now, this image doesn't look quite right because I'm lying. This source image is not S-gamut, slog2, but for the purposes of our demo, this is fine. So I would set up the simplest form of color management that you can, a single node of color management, like so. We're going from S-gamut, if that's indeed your color space, and slog2 into Rec 709 gamma 24. And then I would look at the image, see if you've got any of that banding popping up so far. If you do, then it's not a problem with your color management or any of the hoops that your color management is going through. That's just innate of your source, and there's apparently not going to be any great stock way to get out to Rec 709 from your camera negative without introducing that. Or if you're not seeing that banding quite yet, then you can look at opening up your exposure, like you were talking about needing to do with that material, and continuing to go and looking for where does that banding populate? Where does that banding appear, right? Wherever it appears, the simplest solution would be to stop right there if the image will allow, if your taste will allow. If you say, well, I wish I could go further, but I can live with that if it means I have no noise, right? That would be one option. The next thing you could do is go a little bit further and then start to look at softening the image in some way with some noise reduction, some mid-tone detail, maybe even some light blur. You could look at actually how you could soften out and deal with that banding if you do indeed find yourself stuck with it, because by the time you expose up, it's appearing a little bit. But that's kind of how I would think about a process like that. Simplify it as much as possible. Simplify your color management down to the simplest form possible. See if you're getting the banding. Then add an ingredient of exposing up. See if you're getting the banding. And then it really depends on what's more important to you, the job or figuring out your workflow. If none of those things are introducing banding, then it sounds like something in your stock color management might be, in which case you could start to test and explore where that issue is being introduced in there. But my hunch, based on your description, is probably that banding is just in there, and it's only becoming more obvious when you generate a Rec 709 image. And the best thing that I can say for dealing with that is going to be to go with a lower contrast for your output. So if you're using anything beyond stock color management, then maybe skip it. Like like my 2383 LUT, for example, might be too heavy for applying to that material. And what you can even do in addition to that is upstream. If let's say you've got, I'm actually going to start building out the node graph here. We've got exposure over here. This is like my stock node tree up here. You could even look at, as part of your de facto color management or your sort of display rendering, you could even look at doing a node immediately upstream of your final output transform node. And you could use my mid-gray cheat sheet and take a look at what the middle value is for, the mid-gray value is for S-log3. I actually don't remember what that is off the top of my head, but let's say that it's in the neighborhood of a 0.35 or so. And you could just do some contrast pivot and open up your contrast a little bit more. And all that's going to do is, if you're expanding or softening contrast rather around the mid-gray point of your image, theoretically that's going to mean that you don't need to expose up as much because your shadows aren't going to be crunching as much. You'll probably have a little bit less of that impulse to do so. And because you're not exposing up as much, if that is indeed what's causing your banding, you'll find that you're getting less banding in the image. So it's kind of I think I made this analogy here in grade school not that long ago, but I always think about like the beginning of Jurassic Park when they're slowly like dusting the sand off of the dinosaur fossils that they find out there in the Badlands. That's the idea here. Is you've got a delicate, it's not quite a fossil, but you've got a delicate entity, a delicate artifact, this image. So you want to figure out, okay, what can I do to reveal it to me, to enhance it and bring it out without causing any damage. So I hope that's some useful strategies for dealing with that kind of material.
All right. Kushik is wondering, can you explain the difference about data levels in the delivery page? Is video best? Is full best? What's the difference?
Oh yeah, great question. So data levels. We've talked about this before, but it's been a little while. I'm just going to reset my stock color management here before we go over and look at data levels. So let's get a grasp of the big concepts there first. So when we talk about data versus video levels, I'm going to put that back on there just because I like looking at it. So data versus video levels. Let's say at the end of the day, for any display that we are going to send an image to, we're going heavy on math today. I hope you guys don't mind. Any display that we're going to send an image to, that display is going to theoretically have the ability to show a unique pixel for any value of red, green, or blue, which falls between 0 and 1. Does that make sense? Any value in between 0 and 1 for red, green, or blue, or any combination thereof, is going to be capable of producing a unique output from that display. So that's the ground truth. Any display that we are mastering for, we are assuming, hey, if I send you RGB triplets which fall between 0 and 1, you will be able to reproduce those as I intend, right? Data that is what we could think of as the default setup, or what we could call full or data levels, meaning that full 0 to 1 range, that's fair play. Okay, if we think about video levels, or what are sometimes called legal levels, all that means is, okay, this display, let's say my reference monitor over here on my right, it has more constraint than 0 to 1. It's only going to look between, say, I forget how the actual math of this works out in a 0 to 1 domain, but let's say like 5 to 95. If you send it a value of 0.05, it will reproduce the darkest pixel that it possibly can. So if I send it a triplet of 0.05, 0.05, 0.05, so red, green, and blue all at that level, it will reproduce the darkest pixel that it's capable of reproducing. What happens if I send it a 0.04? Same exact result. It can't get any darker, right? So its effective floor is not 0, but 0.05. And by the way, I'm making those numbers up. I don't actually remember off the top of my head in 0 to 1 domain what legal levels actually scale to. If anyone knows in the chat, feel free to correct me. But I'm saying for the sake of the conversation, 5%, 0.05. So below 0.05, doesn't matter if you're sending data. There is nothing that the display is, it's not going to do anything. It's going to map that 0.05 to its 0. Does that make sense? On the upper end, same thing. If I send a triplet of 0.95, 0.95, 0.95, this display will reproduce the brightest pixel that it is capable of reproducing. If I send a triplet of 0.96, 0.96, 0.96, identical result, because it is mapping 0.95 to its 1, or to its ceiling, or to the brightest output that it can produce from those pixels. So that's the only difference between full and video levels, or full and legal levels. And if legal levels sound like a drag and sound like something you wouldn't want, then you're correct. They're not something that you would want. They are a drag. They're an outgoing legacy thing that we generally don't need to worry about. And all of that preamble really just leads to a simple rule of thumb. If you are mastering your image, and by the way, I'm actually mastering right now, I think I'm in video levels. Yeah, I'm using video levels, and I usually leave this turned on. But I've got my video levels turned on because on my client monitor over here, that's what it's set up to expect, because it's a consumer device. So I actually am sending it video levels because it expects video levels. And so I'm mastering using video levels. Now, as long as my deliverable is encoded with video levels, all is fair. The only time this would be an issue is if I master with video and then I deliver in full, or vice versa, if I master in full and then deliver in video. So virtually always, like, there's really no situation I can think of off the top of my head where you would change your data level setting here on the deliver page to anything other than auto. Let the deliver page follow whatever you've done in your master settings here, and let it encode there properly over here. Because again, it's kind of like our conversation that we had earlier about, should I send YUV to a YUV monitor or RGB to an RGB monitor? It actually doesn't functionally matter as long as those things agree. If you master video and you output with video levels, all's good. If you master full and you output with full levels, you will get an identical image to that first example. The only problem is when you mix and match. Does that make sense? So you just want everything to agree. And really, this is all going to be driven, as we could see in my case, it's going to be driven by what your monitors can do. Now, if you are working just with a reference display, full levels is the better way to go, simply because it's the more conservative and simpler solution. It's one less hoop to jump through, but ultimately it doesn't really matter as long as all of the hardware and metadata and encodings all agree with one another, if that makes sense. Hope that helps.
Michelle is wondering, how do you work with long shots, length, time-wise, where lighting changes and you can't fine-tune the different locations or, I guess, the different parts of the shot?
Oh, that's a fun question. So I was, as I'm listening, I was thinking about, well, where could we kind of demo that out, sort of. I think this image, we could get a decent crack at it. Let's turn on a render cache, because I'm on just a poor old iMac for today. So let's do, and let me point some render caching to a sensible location. Yeah, the desktop is fine. All right, so this, I swear, is a moving image. It's just going to take a second to figure its life out. So I've already got my color management set up on this. This is something actually that we spend a fair amount of time talking about in my Colorist Career Accelerator course. Any CCA alums here today? Let me know. Give a shout. But here's the basic workflow that I talk about in that course. This cache is not blowing my mind. I guess it's getting there. I shouldn't be so greedy. All right, well, we might not get real-time playback. But let's just say that we're going to want a different exposure here than, say, here. In fact, this kind of doesn't feel like it needs much adjustment in this case, but let's just say for the sake of argument that we want some kind of change. Here's how I like to think about that. We got to find a way to make things as simple as possible and to have some kind of anchor to this thing. Because otherwise, what you can end up with in that situation where you've got a moving shot and you really do want to change the grade over time is you can end up with like this symphony of keyframes and have a really difficult time tuning that as you go, especially if you're in the room. It's funny, we were talking about this. I actually was just grading a film this week that has a bunch of longer shots where just little nudges, not anything big, but we want to make little temperature or contrast or exposure nudges as the contents of the frame change, right? And I was in the room with clients working on this, and I was even thinking about it then, like, you know, how important it is to be able to quickly respond to like, hey, we feel like when we round that corner over there and we're looking into that room that we'd like the light to feel a little bit warmer. I don't want them to have to wait 5 minutes for me to build those keyframes. And then if they say, oh, well, I feel like it's starting to warm up a little earlier than it really should, I don't want them to have to wait 2 minutes for me to figure out where that keyframe is and to move it. I want to be able to respond intuitively and work quickly. So that's the whole goal with this. There's a million ways to do what you are asking about. It's not a question of how can we accomplish that and resolve. There's a million ways to do it. The functionality is there. The question is, how can we do it in the simplest, cleanest, quickest way? Here's how I like to do that. So what I like to do, depending on how long the shot is, this can be a kind of arbitrary call, but the first thing you have to do is decide, all right, what's my anchor? What is the portion of the shot in time that if I grade to it, if I could only have one static, this is the best way to think about it. If I could only have one grade, if I couldn't have an animated dynamic thing at all, what would that grade be? What grade would best serve the greatest amount of this shot? Does that make sense? That's where you want to start. That's where you want to begin, is to set a level that's going to do the best it can for the entire shot, and just pretend for that first stage that you don't even have the ability to animate or to dynamically alter those parameters. That's step number one, and that's going to be a question fundamentally, as grades always are in my book, of exposure, ratio, and balance. How are you setting those things? Okay, that's number one. And then if you've got a foundation that best serves the greatest amount of the shot, you can simply look at like, okay, where is the moment that is least well served by that shot? Where is the moment that, even though I tried to serve the entirety of the shot, this moment here, and let's say it's in the case of this, like the contrast is getting a little heavier because we're not getting any more of that flare from the overhead source. The contrast is really dropping and those blacks are getting too inky for me. Let's say that this is that moment. I'm like, all right, we've gone too crunchy here. And even though I try to come up with a best fit grade, that grade fits most poorly here. You follow what I'm saying? It's kind of it's more of a mental riddle and a set of concepts than it really is, oh my goodness, how do I do this? Easy to do. We want to get really clear on what we're trying to do and on thinking through what the shot actually needs. So once I've identified, all right, here's my base grade, serves the majority of the shot as best it can. Here's the moment in the shot that is most egregiously underserved by that base grade, and that's what I'm going to grade my compensation to. And then we want to, again, think simply as possible, what's the simplest, smallest set of adjustments that I could make that will bring this image back in line with the rest of the shot? In this case, I would argue a simple contrast adjustment would probably do the trick. So let's say if we're starting here, this is kind of like my hero or my anchor point that I graded to, and then here's where I'm going to be adjusting. all I'm going to do is go down here into my secondaries branch of my node graph. We've talked about this node graph template plenty here on the channel. There's a whole video on it if you want to brush up on why I'm doing my node graph in this way. But suffice it to say, for now, I have a secondaries branch down here, right? And this localized adjustment, this time localized adjustment, to me is just another secondary, right? So all I'm going to do is go in here and look at my contrast. And as you saw me do it just a moment ago, I've got a still that I've grabbed for like my kind of anchor or my reference point, and I'm going to start wiping to that. So let's turn this gallery off. Let's turn these clips off and start to get a better look at kind of where we're coming from, where we're going type of thing. So something like that, in this case, that's all that I need. I just want to get a little bit more of that smoky, flared black point that I was getting when that overhead source was pinging my lens, and that I'm now losing because that overhead source is being sort of eyebrowed by my subject. All right. So in this case, all that's needed is that little contrast nudge. Okay. So we're well on our way. We've got a foundational grade. We've got an augmentation for the moment in the shot most in need of that augmentation. And now all we have to do is animate that augmentation off and on, right? And here's the next like sort of constraint that I will impose onto this process for myself is I will only animate one thing when I'm keyframing things in Resolve. I'll only animate one parameter ever. You know what that parameter is? Key output gain. Okay, are you guys familiar with key output gain? This is literally just like the opacity of a node. This is the amount of influence this node is having. So if I set this node to 0, the key output gain to 0, this contrast adjustment is doing nothing at all. It's totally off. This is the parameter that I want to animate. I just want to turn the entire node off or on. That way, if my adjustment was more complex, there was maybe some gamma thrown in there or a little bit of saturation or some gain or whatever, it can all be controlled by one master slider, that key output gain, without needing to have a bunch of separate animated keyframed tracks. So what we're going to do here in node number 2, we're going to go to our keyframes, click this drop down menu, and here under defocus, we're going to drop some keyframes. And this is the part that I'll usually do in collaboration with my client. And I'll say like, all right, so starting around here, you know, I kind of want to ride with this disappearance of the flare. So I'm going to say starting around here, up until this point, this node should have no influence whatsoever because I'm happy with my grade already. So right now my key output gain is going to be at 0. Now, by the time I get to here, I'm going to add another dynamic keyframe just to this defocus track, which by the way corresponds to key output gain. Why defocus means key output gain, I couldn't tell you, but it does. Okay. So by this point, I want to be full strength on this bad boy. I want to be completely introducing that contrast shift. And then same thing, I'm going to look and see, do I need to animate that out? And in this case, I do, because we are going to track back out and get that flare back in place. So I'm going to drop another dynamic keyframe here. Say from this point to that point, this node should be in full effect, right? And now from here to the next keyframe that I'm about to draw, it should be politely seeing itself out, okay? So now I'm going to go to my key output gain and hit 0. And if you want to cycle through your keyframes, you can use your little brackets above your return key. So I'm just cycling through my keyframes and I'm saying like, okay, we're at 0 here, good. By the time we get here, we're at 1. By the time we get here, we're still at 1. And then from there to here, we're going back to 0. And then all that remains to do is to play it down. And it's better if you can get it to play back at speed. But once you've got it playing back at speed, it's really easy to see like, all right, am I animating that in invisibly? Is it impossible for the viewer to see? It should, put it this way, when you're making keyframed adjustments like this that are based on responding to what you're seeing in the image and sort of wanting to smooth things out, the transitions should be less noticeable after you have added your keyframes than more so. So the keyframes should be totally transparent, and we're just, the image actually feels more consistent as a result of them. And I would say that that, at least at a glance here, feels like it's the case. So I feel like we're in the realm of long, fancy answers today, but this is a great question to ask, and it's all about what your concepts are, how you assess and understand the shot before you touch a darn thing within Resolve, and then how you come up with a very, very simple implementation. Because Now things are very easy. If my client says, oh, I feel like I can detect that shift a little bit. It's starting a little bit late. I can go, oh, okay, no problem. Let's start it a little bit earlier, like so. Or end it a little bit earlier, or end it a little bit later. It's all just driven by the minimum set of keyframes necessary. And if I even within here want to further refine the adjustment and do like what I talked about, like maybe add some gamma to the adjustment, I can do that, and it's automatically going to get rolled into that same set of keyframes. I hope that's helpful. This is a great question, and again, it's like the functionality is there in spades. We just want to figure out how to like very efficiently navigate it. So I hope that helps.
Okay, Larry is wondering how to calculate exposure by stops in using linear gain.
Ooh, this is a mathy day. You guys came in here in a mathy mood. All right, so if you want to know the formula for calculating exposure in stops, that is your input times 2 raised to the power of the number of stops that you want to increase or decrease. So in the case of like using my gain here, let's just break out a calculator. Let's say that I am here in linear, setting my gamma to linear, and I want to perform exposure in stops. Let's go over here like to Isabella. Let's do our gamma linear here. So obviously a gain of 1 is nothing. But if I want to raise my gain to say, let's say we want to go 2 stops up from here, well, how would we do that? We're going to say 1 times 1 because that's my stock starting value here, times 2 because it's always 2, and then we're going to say 2 raised to the power of 2 because we want to do 2 stops. So that's 4. So if I wanted to get 2 stops over in linear gain, I would have to climb all the way up to a 4 with my gain. Okay? We'll just do one more version of that to make it clear. Let's say we want to go 3 stops over. We're going to say 1 times 2 to the power of 3. That's an 8. So we're going to go like that. And you might have noticed as we're going through here, all that we're actually doing is doubling things as we go along. So the even simpler way to think about it would be, oh, if you want 1 stop, double, so that becomes 2. If you want 2 stops, double that. That becomes 4. If you want 3 stops, double that. That becomes 8. And you can see how those numbers will quickly and wildly go out of control and expand high into the hundreds and 200s. And same thing in the opposite direction. If we want to pull a full stop, we're going to go down to 0.5. If we want to go a full stop down from there, we go to 0.25. If we want to go a full stop down from there, we go to 0.125, and so on and so forth. So that's how we do it. It's input times 2 raised to the power of n number of stops, whatever you wish to add or remove from the image.
All right. Any best practices for applying film grain? For example, getting it exclusively in the shadows or midtones?
Best practices? No. I think film grain is it's something we've talked about quite a bit here in grade school. It's something that obviously is applied a lot to images. Some of you guys may know from prior conversations, I've got no great love lost for film grain. And I think I can say, I think I've managed to go all of 2022 without using film grain once. It's something, if the client says, hey, we're doing film grain, give me your best version of it, then my answer is of course yes. But if the conversation is more along the lines of like, hey, we were thinking we'd really love to do a filmic thing. What would you do for that? I'm not going to pitch film grain in that situation. And if they ask, they say, what do you think about adding some grain? I would say, I think we can come up with better strategies. So I've got no personal, I would be very happy to never see film grain again personally in my grades. However, if you do want to see it, that's because you want to see it, right? It's not because it's some desirable or necessary ingredient. It's because you think it's nice. Strike desirable from that. It's not because it's some necessary ingredient or because it is required to be there, or that you need to emulate a certain process. You're putting it in because you like how it looks. Maybe it makes you feel like you're in an old movie. Maybe you like the character of it. Maybe you feel like it helps elevate the image in some way. That's totally fair play. We don't have to agree on that. But if you're using it, then you're just using it because you like it. So I would actually simply encourage you to develop your eye for film grain and look at the different ways that you can impart it into your image. So if we look at, like, I'll show you how I would do film grain today, okay? So I'm going to do it in a layer mixer simply because I like the control. I'm going to do this once, like at the timeline or at the look level. I'm going to set my film grain node to grain only, and then I'm going to set my composite mode typically to overlay here. And then I'm also down here on the bottom node going to soften things just a hair, because that's going to help sell the grain, if that makes sense. So that would be kind of a stock setup. And then, you know, like all of these things, by the way, all these presets, these are just going to change around these parameters down here. So you can use a preset, or you can play with the parameters yourself, and you can actually see what's happening when you do that. And in terms of like distributing this more or less into different areas of the image, I think that's a great question to ask and a great thing to play with. Like, if you're going to use grain, you should be using the most articulate version of the grain that you would like to see as possible. So let's just say, for example, that we really wanted to sort of confine this into our middle region, and we want to keep it flagged off of the low and the high values. That's just one like recipe that we might be after. There's any other number that you could just as equally want to do. But let's say I'm just going to go over here to my qualifier, and yeah, can you believe it? We're using a qualifier. What we'll do actually in this case is we are going to, this is fun. I haven't actually thought about this in a while. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to do a serial node prepended from this grain node here by hitting Shift S. And what we're going to do is, the grain actually doesn't even need to be connected to anything, but I'll leave it connected. And we are going to produce a key from our image here in node number 3, and then pass it forward into the grain node. So if I now look at my image and look at my qualifier, I'm going to qualify the zone that I wish to see grain fall into. So something like this, I'm going to set a low threshold, go nice and soft down there, really, really soft. And then up here on the high end, maybe the same thing. I'll look at like potentially flagging that off. And again, go nice and soft up there. And now this key that I'm pulling is driving the domain of the grain. Does that make sense? You see what I'm doing there? So that would be how I would approach, like, for example, driving grain into different portions of the image. And you can already see here, even though it's soft, this qualifier to me is not great, because like when I look at the image, like this patch looks strangely clean compared to its neighbors. So it's something you would really want to play with, both in looking at the actual highlight here, but also now just looking at, okay, well, how does this end up affecting the image? And now I'm passing that forward, and you can see, like, if I were to set this, like reset it, or actually, what would be a good way to fully disable that, to audition what it's like with it? I mean, probably the easiest thing to do here would just be to delete this node. So there's what it looks like not qualifying it at all. And if I hit Command Z, here's what it looks like kind of flagging that grain into different regions. So that's a really fun thing to play with. This is the way I like to do it, even though, like, you know, you can look in your advanced controls here. And if you're not doing this whole complicated stack that I'm showing you, and you just do a single grain node and you look at how much is hitting the shadows, midtones, and highlights, you can do a similar thing. I just like the level of control and the level of feedback that I'm able to get by doing things this way. And I also like being able to blur the underlying image kind of to taste. So those are some things that I would explore with grain. If you're going to use it, you should use it with full creative authorship, and really make it something that you spend time nuancing, as opposed to, you know, saying, oh, we're doing a film emulation, so we have to use grain. So here's the stock grain, so throw it on there. That's sort of like the form of grain in color grading that really bothers me. It's like, oh, so you're just like, you know, putting celery in the dish because you think celery belongs in the dish, but you don't like the way celery tastes, or you didn't, you know, like cook the celery or source the celery in a way that you find particularly appetizing. You just heard that celery is supposed to go in a dish. And I'm not, of course, saying that about the person asking the question or any of us here. I'm just saying that's a temptation I think we can all be sort of enticed by, of like, oh, well, we're doing film emulation, so I guess I got to add grain. And I guess the way you add grain is with the film grain node, and I'll dial back the overall strength to somewhere reasonable, and I guess I'm done. I think you can go a lot further with that. And that further may even include saying, yeah, I'm emulating some characteristics of film, but I'm not emulating grain, because as we all know, hopefully, emulating film, when we say emulating film, what we mean is selectively emulating film. There's all kinds of properties that we cannot or would not want to emulate about a traditional film system. So another long but hopefully interesting exploration here today in grade school.
All right. Michael is wondering if there is a way of going from RGB to a subtractive CMY color method.
Ooh, yes, there is. So, oh, darn. Yeah. Yes, there is. I'll put it to you. I'll share these resources with you for this. I have a video on mixinglight.com where I talk about this method explicitly, about how to, like, essentially, instead of working in RGB, how to work in CMY in a sort of subtractive context. And I am also developing a product in this space with a partner, and I'll be able to share more about that. And I think that product will be available sooner than later, but it's very much overlaps with that question. So yes, there definitely is. And yes, it's pretty darn cool. And I'll also just point out as sort of another aspect of that, I've shown you guys this vector balance tool that I use a lot when I'm grading. So this is literally like a substitution that I will use for a normal, like, RGB offset, like trackball type of color balance. Like literally the balance node in my node graph is often occupied by this tool as opposed to an RGB balance. And it works the same way. It just gives different controls. So what it's doing is saying, pick a hue angle and then tell me how far toward that hue you would like to move. So I've got a hue angle that's around a negative 0.11, which, like, if I pull up my vector scope and I say that I want to show the vector, you can actually see in my vector scope, oh, it's very, very faint. But check this out. You can see the trace. That's one of the reasons I have this vector. Check this out. Can you see that little trace when I turn that off and on? That's showing me the vector that I'm marching along when I do this, okay? So as I saturate, I'm moving toward that image. And the other control that I have in here that I really like is I can make that a subtractive thing or an additive thing. So right now I am getting to that sort of like greenish red, that yellowish color, by subtracting however much blue and green I need to get there. Does that make sense? That's different than doing it additively. This, by the way, is exactly, if I were to be doing this as gain in Resolve, this is what that formula, this is what gain being applied in Resolve looks like. You are adding, in this case, if you were moving the trackball northwest, you would be adding red and green until you get to where you want it to be. In this case, I am subtracting blue and green until I get the result that I want. So you can see, even though I'm getting the image to a similar temperature, there's a very different feeling here. And essentially, as I saturate, I am losing luminance because I'm getting more colorful, which is a fundamentally subtractive approach to color grading. So that's a tangent. This is not something that I have immediate plans of making available because it's kind of cumbersome at the moment. But I encourage you to check out that mixinglight.com video where I talk about working in a subtractive context, and to stay tuned in this space. And I'll have something more to announce about that, I think, sooner than later. But a great question, and it's a very fruitful thing to play around with inside of Resolve for sure. All right, we got time for one more question.
Okay. Let's see. Christopher is wondering if there's any new LUTs or tools coming to your store in the near future.
Yes. Yes, there are. We've got a lot of new exciting stuff happening right on the 1st of January, like a ton of really cool new stuff. I think I may be able to give you a little bit more of a peek into that when we do our final grade school of 2022 next year. I'll give you a little bit of more info on that. But yes, there's some really, really cool new stuff coming. That coding vortex that I mentioned coming out of at the beginning of grade school today, that was a coding vortex of stuff that I'm developing for you guys that I'm really, really excited about. So yes, there is some cool stuff coming, and I should be able to share a little bit more about that with you in our final grade school of 2022 next week. And that's a pretty good place to wrap for today, guys. I can't say that we hit a record volume of questions, but I think you guys showed up with some really, really good questions. And I hope that I was able to shake something loose in your brain or get something a little bit clearer for you for all these different questions. These were really substantial topics to explore. So I'm not mad that I think we probably only ended up doing a half a dozen or so explorations, but they were really interesting ones, and we got to go a little more in depth. And these are things that we either haven't talked about at all in grade school before or haven't talked about in quite some time. And I feel like as episodes of grade school stack up, that gets harder and harder to do, to find new stuff that we haven't talked about or haven't talked about quite recently. So thank you guys for showing up with your awesome questions, and thank you for a really fun session. Hope you had as much fun as I did. Thanks to Gadali for co-hosting with me. I hope you guys have an awesome holiday, or that you're having an awesome holiday. If you're here today, thanks for giving me 1 hour of your holiday season. Have a great Christmas if you celebrate Christmas. And either way, I will see you back here for grade school next week, where we're going to talk about kind of how we're wrapping out our 2022 and finish things off strong in our color grading adventures for 2022. You guys have an awesome day, awesome weekend, awesome holiday. See you very soon.